Okay, great. Let's get going on chapter 2, and this will be week 2. I can bring up the material here in the content tab. One thing I thought I'd talk about a little bit here is the kind of the evolution of trade. This is actually what it's all about, is where we've come from. So what you'll see is, I like to tell a little story about the evolution of trade, and that is that imagine 2,000 years ago, 2 or 3,000 years ago, what are people trading? What are people doing in international business as post-caveman? Well, they're trading spices. Spices were valuable. Imagine that Mexican spice that you've never had. Imagine smelling something being cooked that you've never had. People will pay a lot and do a lot to get those things. So we started trading spices, and then we soon learned that salt was preservative for a lot of food, and that changed the world. So people started to trade larger amounts of salt. Salt got to be a pretty big one. So think about the earliest man, and all he has is a backpack. So he's going to throw 100 pounds of salt or spices or whatever he can on his back, and he can't get very far with 100 pounds. So he's going to get a yak or a camel or a cow or a horse or something like that to carry that. Maybe he'll get a caravan of a few of those. So each animal now is carrying 200 or 300 pounds of stuff, maybe more. Maybe you can get a long line. But that still doesn't do it. Then we invented boats, and they got bigger and bigger and bigger. And now, obviously, a boat can transport tens of thousands of pounds. So all of a sudden, we've gotten to global standards, big time trade here. What was going on in the early days of Europe's development was their trade with China. So China produced silk, a secret of how it was made, and ceramics, well-made China ceramics. And so the Europeans started to develop, after the Silk Road, which they were carrying on the yak, they developed the boats where they could carry large amounts, and the rest is history. We moved into colonialism too, where nations that were already well developed would move into very underdeveloped nations and take their resources. Pretty controversial right there. That developed into something called international financing. International financing is how you would pay for a long excursion. Imagine going from Europe to Africa or Brazil or China or something for extended periods of time. You invest your money and you don't get any return for many, many, many months. So the idea of investment in a corporation was born, and we got stocks. Stock markets were born that way, or shares of companies. This chapter speaks to mercantilism, which is what I'm kind of talking about. In the days of Adam Smith, we moved into specialization. Adam Smith is the father of modern economics, they say, and he would concentrate on specialization, and that allowed for much greater efficiency. Another concept in this chapter that's very important that was learned is absolute advantage and competitive advantage. Very important to understand. Absolute advantage, which is just one person being better in all ways than one country being better at production in all ways than another. But the key is competitive advantage, which suggests that you're giving up less to produce more of something. So that if you don't have to give up much in sacrifice to produce something, then you've got a competitive advantage. And you can beat an advantage, or an absolute advantage, with a competitive advantage. So let's see, just looking through what we have this week, we've got the chapters, the media quiz on Dubai this week. There's a little discussion that we're going to have on Legos and how the Lego company came to be something that was pretty impressive. The point-counterpoint is on carbon tariffs, and I know a lot of students are always interested in carbon tariffs. So to conclude, today's modern trade world has everything to do with governments and managed trade, which would be putting up barriers, dropping barriers, opening this barrier, closing this barrier. I think you can pick that up in the news that's going on today, as we've worked on a lot of ways to promote trade. In the last 20 years, we've broken down those barriers to promote trade. In the last couple of years, 2 years specifically, we have put up new barriers that limit trade. I don't necessarily agree with those, but that's the way those things go. The world ebbs and flows with barriers that come up and go down and come up and go down. That's how trade is promoted and trade is limited. Think about why you would limit trade. Well, you would limit trade to support your own personal country, your own interests. So that's what we're doing this week, and I think that's going to get you going. It's a pretty interesting chapter. Thank you.